Hi, I'm Dave Vickers and welcome to The Photo Show. And I hope everyone out there is keeping safe and well in these extraordinary times that we're living in. What we're going to do in this episode is the second part of our basic photography course. If you missed the first part, I'll put a link up here so you can click on that and have a look. In that episode we were talking about what a camera is and how it actually works. In this episode we're going to dive a little bit deeper into the processes which allow you to take photographs. Now this basically comes down to three things, much in the same way as when you learn to drive a car, you learn the brake, the clutch and the accelerator. If you drive an automatic you didn't do the clutch bit, but you know how to change the gears. So there's basically three things here that we're looking at. And those three things in photography are shutter speed, aperture and ISO. And what we'll do, let's break down each of those, explain what they are, what they do, and then we'll show you how you put those things together to start creating the photographs that you want to make. Now these three things, shutter speed, aperture and ISO, are quite often grouped together in what's called the exposure triangle, because these are the three processes you use to get the correct exposure to take a photograph. The way I like to explain it is, imagine instead of it being a triangle, that it is a seesaw or a set of weighing scales. Your ISO is your pivot point, and that's where everything else works off from. You have shutter speed on one side and aperture on the other. And when you have a correct exposure, everything is balanced. If you change one of those things, your aperture or your shutter speed, it suddenly goes out of balance. And you need to adjust the other side to bring it back into balance. So correct exposure is when you have the correct amount of light reaching your sensor to record an image. If you change one end of that, say adjust the aperture, suddenly it's out of balance and you don't have the correct exposure. You need to change what's on the other end of the seesaw or the scale to bring it back into balance. All of this will become clear, but with that simple process in mind, if you imagine the balance scale and a correct exposure is then balanced, if you change one thing, you're probably going to have to change another. So let's break this down into its individual components. Let's start with shutter speed. Now what is shutter speed? In most cameras, just before the sensor is what's called a shutter curtain, and this is normally made up of two pieces. And if you imagine them like curtains being closed, and what they're doing is they're preventing light from reaching the sensor. When you push the shutter button, these curtains will open and close for a very brief amount of time, allowing light to pass through and reach the sensor. Now the amount of time that it takes these curtains to open and close is what's called your shutter speed. Shutter speed is normally measured in fractions of a second. 1/60th, 125th, 1/250th of a second are all typical shutter speed values. And what that number relates to is the amount of time that the curtain opens and closes. So 1/60th of a second, when you push the shutter curtains will open and close within 1/60th of a second, a very short amount of time. As you increase that, let's say up to 1/250th of a second, that's how quickly the shutter curtains open and close. They're much faster. Let's take a look at the shutter on an old film camera and hopefully this should make things a lot clearer. Okay, so to demonstrate how a shutter actually works, what I've done is I've opened up the back of an old film camera. Now you can't normally see this part on a digital camera because your sensor will sit here and the back of the camera is solid and you can't open it up. But on a film camera you can open and close the back to expose the shutter. This area here is what's called your shutter curtain. On this camera it's a cloth shutter curtain. I will say now that not all modern cameras operate the same kind of shutter system, but the principle is exactly the same. This will really help you understand how a shutter actually works. So if I wind the camera on forward, as we're winding it there, can you see there's a join? And that is the two shutter curtains. That is what opens and closes to allow light to pass through to reach your sensor or film. So now if I push the shutter, you can see there that the shutter opened and closed. The camera at the moment is set on 1/60th of a second. So the time it takes the shutter to open and close is 1/60th of a second. If we now speed the shutter up to 1/250th of a second and push the shutter, you can see that's much quicker. Let's go back to a 60th. 1/60th of a second, 250th of a second. And you can see that the time that the shutter is opening and closing is much quicker between the two. So 1/60th of a second is a slower shutter speed, 2/50th of a second is a faster shutter speed. What I'm going to do now is I'm actually going to bring the shutter speed right down. We'll bring it down to something like 1/4 of a second. So I've now set our shutter speed at 1/4 of a second. So it will now, instead of it being a 60th of a second, it will now open and close in 1/4 of a second. So a lot slower. So you should be a lot easier to see how this is actually working. So let's press the shutter. You can see there within 1/4 of a second, the shutter opened and closed again. So let's do it again. And one more time. And what's happening here is the shutter curtain is closed in normal operation and is blocking any light that's come through the lens from reaching your sensor or film, which would be around here where my finger is here. That's where the sensor would sit, and the shutter opening and closing would allow light to reach the sensor to record an image. So at the moment it's shut and it's light tight and it's not allowing any light through. When you press your shutter, it opens, allows the light through, and then shuts back off again. And that is the basis of shutter speed. That is how your shutter works, and that is what shutter speed is. This is the shutter speed at 1/4 of a second. This is the shutter speed at 1/60th of a second. And this is the shutter speed at 2/50th of a second. That's the principle of how the shutter actually works. A lot of modern cameras will have a different system. Some have an electronic shutter, but we'll look at that in more detail in a later episode when we're looking at different types of camera. But for now, this is exactly how the shutter works in a camera. So now we've seen how the shutter works in the camera. Why would you change your shutter speed? Now there's two reasons. With all of the processes in photography, there's normally two reasons. There's a technical reason and an artistic reason. Let's start with the technical reason. Now the job of the shutter is to regulate the amount of time that light is allowed to reach the sensor in the camera. Therefore, the opening and closing regulates the amount of time that light hits the sensor and then is blocked off again. And that therefore gives you control over how much light reaches the sensor to record an image. Now on the artistic side, because you have the ability to adjust the amount of time that the shutter is open and closed, it allows you to record images in a different way. If you're using a very fast shutter speed, let's say 1/1000th of a second, so if you're photographing something that is fast, like a runner, a racing car, a bird in flight, that very fast shutter speed will only record a very short amount of that object's movement, and therefore it will freeze the image, like in images like this. So what you're actually doing is you're freezing a moment in time. You're capturing a very quick moment in time. On the opposite side, if you're using a slow shutter speed, the amount of time that the curtain opens and closes is much longer, and therefore it's recording a longer amount of time. The shutter speed records the amount of time that light reaches the sensor, so therefore it records the amount of time that is being photographed. If you're using a slow shutter speed, if you want to photograph something like the light trails from cars on the highway, you would use a slow shutter speed, because the shutter is opening and closing for a longer amount of time. It's therefore recording a longer amount of the action. So that's the absolute basics on shutter speed. Just to recap, shutter speed records time. The shutter speed regulates the amount of time that light reaches the sensor, and therefore is regulating the amount of time that is recorded of an event. Fast shutter speed, very small amount of time. Slow shutter speed, longer amount of time. Okay, hope that bit's clear. As I said before, if you've got any questions, leave them in the comments below and we'll try and answer them the next time round. Let's move on now to aperture.